Great, we'll begin.
Yeah, let's go.
Sure, I think we have a good crowd. Well, everyone, thank you for joining on the International Privacy Day. Well, Krishna, first of all, wishes on the most awesome day of the year, where everyone kind of sits back and kind of understands how important privacy is in a context of a nation or an individual.
Absolutely. I think over the last few years, what has also changed is that there has been a lot of adoption around data privacy across the globe, especially laws that are being introduced. And of course, DPDP is also now doing the talks, and we have been in so many discussions around how exactly the DPDP is different from GDPR, and sort of also have to lose out on those GDPR habits, which are really, really hard to ignore, because when you tend to look at certain pieces and then you tend to map it to GDPR and then you map it back to the DPDPA, there is a huge difference which most organizations don't understand. And I'm looking forward to just share what we have been doing and what we have noticed across in the industry when it comes to engineering specific challenges from a consulting angle. So happy to be here, Shashank. Thank you so much for having me here.
No, great. I think, yeah, very valid point about the GDPR, DPDA differences. Uh, Somehow, I felt so nice about reading that I wrote a document a couple of months back on that. But well, uh, to all of you who have joined us, thank you very much. Uh, First time ever, Redacto is doing. Krishna is well known for his webinars, but he was very grateful when I had discussed with him the thought that uh, let's start something about engineering, let's start something about privacy, and hence here we are. We also waited, by the way. We wanted to do this on some auspicious day. Hence, what more, better day than starting it on International Privacy Day. And before I start, uh, a very quick introduction about me. Maybe later, after Krishna, you finish. Why don't you, share about yourself?
Oh, sure. So my name is Krishna, and I am primarily responsible for the consulting delivery here at Dutient. Also a founder here responsible for implementing pragmatic data protection programs. That is sort of our USP. We don't come in and say that here's a checklist that you need to implement. We tend to own the outcomes of our implementation as well, which is sort of something that differentiates us from most other consulting organizations. Our focus always is to make sure that whatever implementation we do, the customer can at least directly or indirectly unlock some value out of it. And I've been helping a lot of organizations implement global data protection programs, including GDPR and a few more. And an engineer by education, which also makes me a little bit happier to be on this discussion, because more of it is with folks who are non-engineers and implementing engineering architecture related stuff. So very, very happy to be here. So that's just a very small brief about me, Shashank.
Great. Thanks, Krishna. And for folks who don't know me, I'm Shashank. I'm the co-founder of Redacto. Redacto is a full-stack data privacy company working in line with AI to not only solve DPDA, but also global privacy implementations. Uh, Redacto was born by engineers, all from engineering background, because uh, we felt through our experiences also. Previously, also I was leading security and privacy portfolios in my previous companies, that there's a huge difference between what legally policies require and what exactly is implemented from an engineering point of view. So we work more with CTOs to kind of translate this language into the language of engineering and technology. So that's how Redacto was born. And that's also a reason why you see a beautiful topic is the first topic ever we took up for our first webinar, is kind of understanding privacy engineering challenges and not only privacy challenges. You would have heard a lot of places about what can go wrong, 250 crore penalty. Absolutely, no denying the fact that there will be huge repercussions on the companies who don't fall in line and kind of take data privacy seriously. But who's going to solve this? Who's going to solve the on ground reality? Who's going to solve that particular thing where you give a consent and that needs to be propagated to maybe 400 downstream systems in real time? And who's going to take care that the cache data doesn't have that consent which has been revoked? Well, amazing. And thank you everyone for joining. Trust me, next 50 minutes, we're going to do a lot of deep dive into a couple of, very good topics. We have chosen like 5 topics to kind of understand and share our experiences also. And in case there are questions, please feel free to drop them. Our entire mandate is that we will try to wrap it up in another 45 minutes and then kind of go into 10-15 minutes spending with all of you, so that a 1 hour session not only gives you a semi masterclass on how engine is going to work out, but also you will have something to think about after this session. Well, uh, to the number one problem statement, Krishna, I think is consent and consent architecture. Uh, here's my mom's test, right? I'll tell you one small this thing. So anything which I do, I have a 5-year-old kid, and also my mother is 60 plus. So I run every thesis of mine with both of them. My mom kind of passes that if she understands, and my toddler, she also has to understand. Like literally, she's explained like I'm 5. So when I told her, look, consent is a tough topic, my mom's first reaction was, I just agree and move on. Who and why do you bother so much? So why is consent such a big halla? Why is like everyone saying, okay, consent manager, just agree and move on, and why it is not?
So I think your mom's test also correlates to this famous Feynman's theory as well, wherein you have to explain something to someone as a under expecting that they are a 5-year-old and probably just put it in simpler terms. But to answer your question, I think apart from the majority of focus on data principles rights, it's also about the potential of misuse with your data, right? All these scams that we are seeing across the industry, all these challenges around identity theft and so on, these are challenges because you just click on agree and move on. Now of course, as an individual to whom this concept may be new, it might also be difficult to fathom as to how deep this problem goes into, right? There is layers and layers of data that is about you out there, and you may not really know how does it impact you, but because someone agrees to just consent and move on, and of course share data to organizations that do not really tell you how they use it, or maybe are going through a lot of breaches, right? All those problems have led to the birth of DPDP in India today as well. There were, of course, various versions of the bill that have been passing around, and of course, a lot of privacy professionals feel that the previous version was much more solid. But then again, I think the balancing act that the ministry has done also gives a lot of rights to users. Now, I'll give you a simple example, Shashank. The other day, I was back in my hometown and I got a call from my mother. And she told me that she got a call from ATS and she has to report to the police station. Now, the cybersecurity professional in me, the data protection professional in me, I told her, don't worry about it. It's all okay. It happens, right? It's just a scam. You have to trust me because I've been in this industry. I manage a company that does exactly this. But despite all that, despite all the assurance, she did went to the local police chowki just to see, just to ensure, just to make sure that there's nothing wrong with it, right? I gave her a step-by-step instructions as well as to what she needs to do, how to block it. And coincidentally, the person, when they were talking to her, they asked her questions about what do you do, what is your profession, and she naturally gave out some of those information. Right now, the professional in me, I got the ick because, of course, it's happening, in my family itself. And despite all the awareness that I do around, it's still not enough for people to understand the gravity of that situation. So just a small example of, despite us trying to, push out this awareness, something like this, it happens because we don't care enough about reading all those pieces. And of course, you can't even expect everyone to do it, which is why the awareness that we create today will help have a more mature ecosystem sometimes down in the future. So that is my hope with everything that we do around this implementation.
No, very valid point. I think I'll share one recent topic which happened, right? We were talking to one of the loan TSPs out there, and TSP business is tough because you need to kind of consume a lot of personal information. And till date, they have been doing this I agree all checkbox and they used to move on. Now suddenly they have to enable consents for all these purposes, right? and there's also a huge amount of audit trail which they have to maintain. Now, they just said, why can't we just club everything? Like in engineering parlance, they use this whole Boolean concept, like it was a 0 and 1. And they said, why can't we just do a Boolean and just move on? Uh, then very interesting discussions happened, wherein they also said that, look, all this is said and done is fine, but how can I make sure that my legacy customers are also, the data has been shared. Also, they said, can we also assume that all the data what we have collected till date is already consented for? Like there is a concept about retroactive consent mechanism for legacy customers.
Mhm.
And the second concept of a Boolean consent, that why can't it just be a flag enabled, and whether it's a metadata or when it's a combined data with different purposes. I think these are some of the discussion points which have a problem statement, number one. And number two, as you were saying, I have a very interesting fact for all of our audience who are in this call. Per day average Indian, uh, the number is 62 crore. 62 crore rupees is lost in fraud because of digital theft on a daily basis. That means Boolean did not work out. I'm sorry. That means someone has access to I know it all. Now, with the entire granular consent architecture, without that, can you trace back, Krishna, to your, in your case of your mother, can we go back and say, how did they get access to your mom's information or her phone number, even though everyone had, a Boolean way of I accept all, which is already enabled?
There is no way to trace it back, Shashank, and that's the biggest challenge. I mean, there could be data breaches that happen, but uh, the source of it, right? That's basically another discussion in itself, where we look at vendors, supply chain, and all these softwares and applications that we use. So the source of a data breach, to identify that, is very difficult because there is no audit trail. All we know is someone gave consent or someone withdrew consent, but then again, we don't really know if we were able to withdraw that from other downstream systems and consent was actually fulfilled. And even if it was fulfilled, what is exactly the audit trail that we are looking at? Because when we get into our assessments and we do those consent reviews, and we come up with recommendations that you need to have it in this way, this is what the law says. But one thing that we have realized in this industry is that no one wants to be the first to do compliance, right? Unfortunately, everyone wants to be the first to be innovative, do new kinds of businesses. But when it comes to being compliant with a specific requirement, or maybe even looking at the consent BRD document and understanding what all attributes need to be captured or metadata that needs to be captured, no one really wants to do it because their business teams and their product teams do not have that understanding, and there are not enough people to also sit with them and also help them understand that this is actually what needs to be done. So that kind of friction is something that we have seen. So plenty of assessments that we have done, but how many of those are actually implemented? The organization is waiting out on the timelines that the ministry has provided. So we see some panic that is there because of these timelines being shortened and reduced and all those rumors that are being spread out. But then again, we don't really know whether when the implementation will actually start, because today everyone is in a state of just seeing what their competitors are doing or seeing what the ministry is doing. And unfortunately, I think we have also noticed a lot of privacy automation platforms and companies have their cookie banners on their website, right? But none of them are actually enforced. Even if they are enforced, they don't really capture what the BRD states. They don't really capture what exactly needs to be in a cookie consent preference center. Using it as an example because it's one of the most visible form of how consent works. But you and I have both seen that implementations, even companies that sell products in privacy, are not doing it today because they don't really, either they don't know about it today and they understand the engineering side of it, or they really want to collect data about you as well, right? Because how will they do business if they don't collect your data?
So yeah, I think very valid point. So there's a saying called "eat your own dog food," and unsurprisingly, when I found out of one of our competition very good friends, I messaged them saying, "Hey, your cookie doesn't work. It's giving me an expire date of 4 years back." But interesting is consent granular capturing. But the next topic is much more interesting, is withdrawal propagation. And I have very interesting, conversations I have on this topic with all the engineering heads across, not only engineering heads, but also the data leaders who are, the chief data officers, yeah, who are running the data engineering team. And I'll tell you what, everyone think, consent acceptance is a store of records. Fantastic. But the problem is, once you store that and it propagates to multiple downstream systems plus processes, again, that is also good. What happens when the withdrawal hits you? I'm not joking. One of the cases where we were working with a company, uh, they had cached their marketing, consents. Even if propagation was happening on time, emails went after the consent was revoked, right? So how do you deal this when you are, consulting companies? Because consent, a lot of people think consent, 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 but what they forget is consent is only 10% of the entire requirement of DPDA. There's huge requirement from propagation also.
Absolutely. I think the uh, sort of a challenge that we face when we audit something like this is that most companies do not even have an inventory or information about what systems actually use that particular consent or process that particular personal data. So I think we take back a few steps and we typically try and understand what is that purpose that they're using that data for. Then we have to ask a lot of questions as to, do you even know what kind of systems your teams are using? I mean, in certain cases, if it's a decentralized team, then the governance of that becomes so much harder, right? There could be teams that are using a platform which the the vertical that is managing consent management does not know of, which means that there's an integration that is left out, and still communications may go out. So that's just one example. But when it comes to withdrawal being as easy as consent, the biggest challenge there is that uh, companies don't make it as easy, right? They don't really want you to withdraw their consent because that means that they may have to stop processing, which they don't want to. So the number of steps that typically are in place to provide consent or to give consent is not the same as withdrawal, and that's a practice that we've seen across all of the assessments that we have done so far. The withdrawal is not easy. The withdrawal is not as simple as we would like it to be, and it is not to make sure that the data principal has that right, and the right to withdraw consent is easy. It is sort of a dark pattern where companies would prefer if they don't withdraw that consent. And to help them understand as to why they should do it and how it exactly solves a lot of other problems, non-compliance is just one of them. When people hear the word compliance, there are bells that are ringing everywhere, and they don't really want to know what needs to be done. So we don't really talk about compliance anymore. Now we talk about transformation. So that's the key change that we are making as a consulting organization, that we don't come and say that we do DPDP compliance. We come and say that we do privacy transformation. And of course, this is a piece that is part of it. So that's just what we have been noticing across in the industry, Shank.
Another interesting, I think we will be spending a little bit more time on this topic because, there are a lot of conversations which we are having in terms of implementations also from Redacto. One, uh, always people think, even today also, that say a DPDA is much more closer to a DPO, but unsurprisingly, it's much more closer to a product manager, by the way, right? It's also closer to an engineering leader. I'll tell you a reason why. Because the amount of the landscape of a product has been optimized in terms of the spacing, the color, the buttons, right? And from there, what propagation happens to the downstream systems and also third-party processes. Of course, we'll cover processes in the further slides, but the entire downstreaming of these events, then segmentation of these events into, maybe a data lakehouse, maybe a customer data platforms, then slicing and dicing that information further to create one more segment of an activity which can be reused to again target another cluster of events, right? Now here's the thing, uh, this conversation when you have with say a data engineering head, they will say our job is to kind of enable the customer success teams or the product teams to have better decision making either in customer acquisition or in product analytics. Now, is DPDA gonna kill that? Because that is one. And second, how many of the companies forget about automating, data discovery for 2 minutes? Definitely, that's the path every company should take, no matter what, because you don't want one engineer sitting out there at night 1 o'clock enables one pipeline which is drawing a parallel personal data which no one also knows. But what is the percentage of companies do you think actually kind of understand the collection points, the products, the engineering DBs they have, the lake houses they have enabled, and this is over and above the lineage. I mean, lineage is definitely one piece, but how many of these companies? Because another interesting piece is whatever we just discussed is also a tribal knowledge in most of the companies. I don't think so. Indian environment has a lot, say, like how GDPR, of course, we have seen, both of us have seen, where uh, Europeans by nature tend to write very good documentation. They have tremendous SOPs. Before starting any process, they're very clear. I want this approvals to be in place. So how does this tribal knowledge also is now playing against the requirement that you should have a control?
No, I think it's really hard to find organizations that have actually done this sort of implementation or even done the assessment and exercise to understand what exactly needs to be done, right? Because what we are seeing is that most organizations are reaching out to us and saying that, can you do a gap assessment for us in 1 month? Right now, 1 month gap assessment, any consulting organization can do if you scope out, right? And that is a challenge because the scope is, first we have to sit with you for a month to understand the scope, because even the IT teams, cyber teams, your data teams do not really know what kind of data flows into what systems and what are those third parties, those supply chain risks that are also arising out of it. The policies, the contracts, all those pieces are okay. Of course, you can get that enforced, you can get it done faster. But from an engineering standpoint, the awareness of exactly how data flows is not there, right? And to do a gap assessment in a month, it is sort of, it defeats the whole objective of doing an assessment, because you know there are gaps, you know what is not there in your organization. Might as well sit with a consulting organization or sit with a data protection expert and see how exactly should we also prioritize certain areas. Should we look at customer data first? Should we look at employee data first? Should we maybe focus on a few systems first? Because most organizations may also have limited bandwidth in how to achieve compliance. So a lot of time needs to really go into the strategy side of things before even getting a gap assessment done. Because if you do a gap assessment in 1 month, you will have to pay double the price in a few more months, because most consulting organizations will not be available, or they may not have the right kind of people to help you with that. So you end up paying twice, and that is what we are seeing today, right? An improper implementation or an improper assessment essentially means that you have to pay twice, because especially if you're in the RE segment, Shashank, you know better than most of us that how auditors will chase you to get certain things done, right? And if you're in that segment and if you've done an assessment that no one really agrees to, that it is actually spot on, you'll have to get it done again. And when you do it again, your time frame would be smaller than what it was before. So the focus is that you sit with someone who is really into the act and understands the engineering side of it, understands the legal side of it. You'll find a lot of legal folks, they are doing a really good job out there as well, but this is a very big engineering problem. It has to fundamentally change how schemas are looked at, how UIs are looked at, and how different systems talk to each other. So that sort of an engineering push and an engineering involvement is a must to implement it. Or else you can always have the fancy policies, your fancy cookie forms, cookie consent forms, TSR forms, all that is there from a front end facing perspective, but in the back end, none of it technically works. And you don't want someone to submit a DSR to question exactly that. People will start doing it. All these LLMs, GEMs have made it very easier to very easy to actually hold any organization accountable. So you can expect a lot of those requests coming in the future.
Me, absolutely. All valid points. I'll just add to this one important crazy, engineering stuff also happens on the ground is when you work with a bigger organization, one thing will come out as a common is even after you do this whole discovery exercise and understand propagation, how it's happening, who owns the service, right? And that becomes such an important topic because on the point in time when you do the review, you can catch on and say, hey, that engineering manager is responsible for this application, this DB, this lakehouse. Then after 1 month, you get to know he is no longer with the org. So one time when we were doing this study, we found out that 80% of the services were orphan. No one, even if you know someone is there, when you don't have a responsible and accountable person, there's no use of finishing one assessment or having no matter fancy tool just to take care of your requirements.
Absolutely. And I think I was speaking to one of our partners, and they mentioned that DPOs are jumping like grasshoppers. Essentially, what they want to say is that there is so much demand in the market for privacy professionals and DPOs that, of course, before even one assessment is completed, or even before you get that remediation report, a DPO is potentially changing their role into a new one. And the company has then, of course, nothing to do much about it, because to find a new DPO, it's much harder to find a DPO of relevance. It's, you can add the complexity to that as well. And to find a DPO that meets your budgetary requirements, we've tried that. We've tried to find people who fit into those requirements. It's very, very tough. So might as well focus a bit more on enabling your CIOs, CTOs, your internal teams, transferring some of that responsibility of implementation to them as well, because a DPO would not be able to get it implemented as good as well as a CTO or a CIO or an engineering leader. So that is just my 2 cents to add on to what you just mentioned.
So that means here's an interesting thought, right? I think every engineering leader out there who is now handling anything, don't forget about personal data, any data, as part of the JD, the moment they join a company, engineering leader, managers, right? They should be given responsibility, like if they are given by HR that okay, these are the 16 people who are going to report to you, they should also have a rule book or a handbook saying these are the 20 services for which you are responsible. You think that will be like a very interesting thing for us to tell the HR folks also out there? Hey, look, now no longer people resource management is the only thing. You also need your leaders to handle the information systems which host actually this personal data and process this.
Interesting thought. I think some countries have criminal penalties specifically for this, but I think the advantage of DPDP is that there are none. So that ownership would definitely also probably filter out the serious ones from the non-serious ones, and probably people who really want to, commit to an organization, help them grow, manage those systems. Because again, as I mentioned before, this is not a one-time compliance activity. This has to be a transformation. There need to be routine tasks that you need to create. You have to continuously or have continual improvement processes in place. And that's a very good thought, but happy to see how other people look at it, because in India, what I am noticing today, Shashank, as well as you, is that a lot of CISOs are also becoming DPOs, which is okay, considering from a perspective that the law doesn't specifically say that you cannot, but goes against a lot of principles that we have learned over our careers on how exactly these governance positions must be looked at. And I think that kind of responsibility should be definitely put onto engineers, because again, it's more of a transformation, it's more of a enablement piece rather than just having one person who's responsible for privacy implementation and compliance in an organization.
Makes sense. I think the biggest and hottest topic is the entire retention and deletion conflicts, and I'll just take a minute to explain where I'm going with this. Is consent withdrawal we saw in the last slide. Everyone has now a right, a data principal has a right nationally that they can go and revoke their consent what they had given earlier for whatever purposes they are working with. Now, beautiful thing is DPDA is not the only act under which companies work. Someone working under RBI has to take care of Reserve Bank's requirements. Someone who is under SEBI has SEBI's own requirements. So DPDA says, please delete, but your sectoral laws will say retain. From a engineering point of view, Krishna, I think the question here is like this. There is a a 9-piece 3x3 what Meety told in BRD about having for each consent you should have a user ID, a log ID, a purpose ID, timestamp. We will discuss in other slides all those 9 things, and one of them is also kind of understanding that when is still the validity is available for that particular consent, right? Now, will the consent tag be overkill? That means when a consent is picked up like a JSON format, and I have a tag enabled that, hey, look, this is the validity because this is what notice or purpose has told me. And the day this happens, if my policy engine runs on this particular consent, then definitely, I have to do a 48-hour notice before erasure. That's the rule it says. But do we need to add another, a sub tag saying that in case you are again, this consent has been considered as part of KYC, which might be PMLA requires you to do 10-year retention. How do companies think? How are they thinking on this? Because this is a huge aspect. Typically, if personal data compliances with engineering is one layer, then this adds like dual layer. Again, I'm not even going into some of the companies what we are talking, by the way, who have multiple licenses. That means they're also dealing with RBI, they're dealing with SEBI, they're also dealing with IRDA or some local law. That means there's also level 3, level 4. Then are we increasing the packet size? And will this kill the latency of every payload? Because end of the day, what people hate is the lag,
Is the
the
slow
basis
process.
will have
Yeah.
slowness.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, very interesting point, Shashank, because these are the kind of conversations I really enjoy when it comes to engineering, right? Because now when you typically go to a consulting organization and ask a consultant that this is the kind of advice that you need about this, they don't look at these aspects at all, right? All they'll check for is now you have the ministry BRD as well, which is now a reference document, the NEGD BRD, of course, and then they create a questionnaire out of it. It's still a checklist approach, right? To go into the depth of understanding how systems will be impacted, how the packet size would increase, or maybe how the customer experience would be impacted. That is not something most consulting organizations are doing today, because again, gap assessment in a month, you won't get that kind of depth. What you would get is a checklist that comes to you, a checklist that will tell you that these are the 10 things that you should have. And unfortunately, if it's a B2B service provider, their customers are also accepting that report. So it goes around, because it's now an ecosystem that is being created wherein the consulting organizations are not doing a complete job because the compliance window is small. But then again, the customer is also not ready to spend as much time to understand the different aspects of it, which kind of also diminishes the strength of the law in itself. Right now, when we work with global organizations, companies in the US and EU, they typically go into this depth. They have that patience to also make sure that all these aspects are checked. And then you have test cases built in to also see whether this kind of effort would actually increase the latency, or maybe not affect the customer experience and the user's experience with the product. So it takes time is what I would say. But today, I don't see any of this being enforced. And with the retention also overlapping across different acts, for certain pieces where a company has to, let's say, comply with RBI requirements or IRDA, those systems are still robust because that has been maturing over a period of time. Now, why I emphasize on the maturity piece is because even companies that are traditionally or meant to comply with GDPR and the PCR, the Privacy Directive, even those companies do not have cookie consent enabled well. Right now, but 5 years ago, probably the number of websites I visited, I just do my own research to see what numbers are actually there. Close to 50% of those websites do not have cookie consent enabled. And unfortunately, some of them were privacy consulting companies as well. Now, to today, fast track to today, 5 years later, what I see is that 50% number would have come down to 20%. Now, only 20% companies are not compliant with cookie consent related requirements. So I don't see this happening immediately. I don't see this happening in even if the act gets enforced, the 13 May window that we have for 2027. But this is something that will mature over time and probably would take another 5 years, in my honest, humble opinion, before organizations really understand the granularity and depth of it.
I think you're right. This is a journey, long journey. Some myth I will break, because I have worked with a lot of sectoral, entities, is that deletion never existed, by the way. Right? It's just lying in some SharePoint somewhere.
Absolutely.
Number one. Number two, what people also forget, Krishna, I think I have seen this in GDPR when I was working on that, is The penalties will not come if someone's laptop is sold or stolen somewhere. No, that will not happen like that. Penalties will happen on systemic abuse of data retention and reusing that. The biggest abuses I have seen is based on some regulatory requirement. Data is kept either intentionally or unintentionally, whatever is the root cause. Number one. And number two, then that's also harvested. I don't think so. Anyone in this meeting today or even publicly would not have received, at least one loan call in last 3 days. Okay, everyone would have received. Your loan is over, boss. It's done. I mean, if you need a loan, you will call back the company. But they have to remind you that they will remind you that, hey, look, 35 years back you took a loan from us. Why don't you take another beautiful loan? Maybe I'll give you 0.001% discount, right? And why is that? The reason is very simple. Systemic abuse of over retention of some data points, which is regulatory required by that sectorial regulation. And when the gap assessments happen, the consulting, gigs happen, I think it's also super important to kind of educate them. Look, DPDA doesn't give you right one to kind of delete everything. Your sectorial will still override. Doesn't mean that sectorial also gives you now, a right to retain this forever. I think the biggest problem also when regulators were talking to us in my previous company in terms of what makes them concerned is getting ombudsman complaint in their portal for those companies who are retaining the data over and above DPD requirement, because regulators have to then go and explain, hey, look, your data is being misused, even though we have told them to put this into a separate safe lock or something like a data storage, which cannot be accessed for processing by any internal or external systems.
Absolutely.
I think that's the number one problem statement which inspectors will look whenever the reviews will start. And that's also the reason why BFSI segment as a sector is kind of seeing much more compliances of DPDA, being implemented. We are seeing a lot of RFPs coming out. Companies are talking to you, talking to us, and that's a simple reason, because inspectors will go out, go for that data which they don't want, ombudsman complaints to come.
Absolutely. And I think an interesting piece of our law is that there is no right to be forgotten. That is right to erasure, and that may not be possible in certain systems, right? And now, of course, how companies have been dealing with it is that they either delete the keys or maybe disable all sort of accesses, put it into archivals and all that. But then again, when you look at those legacy systems, or maybe let's say blockchain, for example, the GDPR allows you to do that because they of course had that in provision. But when it comes to the Indian Act, I'm not really sure how that will turn out, how companies will do it, because it's still a legal gray area is how I would look at it, as to how the right to erasure could be absolute in certain cases, because companies could come back and say that my system doesn't do it. Right now, what do I do?
Yeah.
So erasure is now erasure. Similarly, how GDPR was always risk-based, DPDP is fairly absolute. That you have to take consent, or you have to make sure that you either fall under one of those certain legitimate uses, or you voluntarily share data. There is no risk-based approach where you look at a legitimate interest assessment or you balance out things. It doesn't exist in DPDP, right? It's fairly absolute is how the law has been written today. So those are some of the challenges that I feel add on top of to what we have also discussed from a deletion perspective. That it's not fairly straightforward. It's not a legal document that will save you. You have to figure it out from an engineering perspective as to how you can architect it to also protect you from these requirements.
Absolutely. I think the point number 4, one of the most interesting requirements is when you talk to your architects on the first question, your DevOps team or your team who is handling the engineers who are handling the creation of new DBs is, hey, what are those fields which I have to mandatorily keep, and how do you think about this? I think one of the common topics is just to all the audience here, how do I think? Before I proceed, I'll give you a very simple mnemonic to remember. right? Maybe Krishna, you be the judge. Uh, these are the major 9 months which your payload should have no matter what. Like, have a tattoo. If you're a data engineering team, have a tattoo about this. Three IDs, your log ID, user ID, and purpose ID. This kind of create the base on what is the payload to be identified with. Three things. What are the actions? One, the action type, whether you're it's for consent granting, revoking, or withdrawal. Definitely the timestamp and the status, whether it has been done or has been withdrawn. And finally, three things which will be for the audit trail. Who is the initiator? What is the source from which maybe like the data point, and finally it has to be hashed, otherwise it's useless. Just to give again, I did a mom's test, by the way, on this, wherein how do I explain someone, we use this analogy whenever we do engineering discussions also, is say, Krishna, you are paying me 400 rupees, right, via phone pay. That means you opened up phone pay, you transferred 400 rupees to me, and I received the amount. Now, the phone pay, if you do a similar UPI transaction balance, every UPI will have a log ID of that particular thing. User ID is you. Purpose for which you are transferring to me is sending the money. Action is what you're taking to is to process the money. Timestamp is timestamp. In the status, consent is clicking money to be sent. Initiator is Krishna here. Source IP is your lot of companies have this fingerprinting of your devices. You should do IP. And finally, audit hashing is the UTR number, the unit transfer reference number. So that means, in a way, where I'm going with this, by the way, with the example is, fundamentals exist. Systems have already been built, and I am from payments industry, so payments has done this again and again and again. Trillions of payment transactions are happening in real time with very minimal latency. Then what's the apprehension of people kind of to take care of the trail infrastructure? What are you seeing on this?
Right. So I think the first piece is that this is not something that was usually considered as a part of either their JD or their typical roles that they were granted when they joined the organization. So this is new, and with all things new, I think there needs to be a lot of time that you spend to also help people understand how these translations happen, how it's not as difficult. Which is also why, Shashank, you would have noticed a lot of these fintech companies also probably creating consent management platforms, because they understand this transition. They know that they have built a system or built a workflow that can meet those requirements of a consent management platform, which is why most of these platforms that I have also noticed a lot of fintech organizations have come up with their own consent management platforms. This is primarily because, of course, they understand this from an engineering standpoint, they understand this from a workflow standpoint. But for other organizations that are looking at either buying a platform or building one, they typically I feel that they do not really understand the granularity and the depth of what it may take to actually build something like this. It's of course, uh, most tech companies want to build it themselves because, of course, they see that they can do it. But when it comes to translation and understanding how this architecture would look like and how it would be integrated with their existing ecosystem, that is not what they take into consideration. And also the number of integrations that they will have to build over time, or the connectors that they will have to build over time. Because if you don't even know today what kind of inventory you have, then how would you know the number of integrations that you would have to build potentially to map purposes of consent with all of these pieces? So that's typically some challenges that I see. But then again, a lot of organizations have already started to either attempt at building one, and I'm certain that once the leadership loses patience with it, of course, those consent management, buying those consent management platforms, and that discussion will start very, very soon. So that is what we have also noticed in this industry. We're still trying to have the same conversation as to whether you should build it, buy it, and if you want to build it, we can help you understand how to exactly build it. But then again, those conversations never really carry forward because either the priorities change, or maybe the leadership feels that this is not relevant, or that they get into a conversation for a different topic. So, like you mentioned, that ownership piece, who will exactly own this, is so unclear in an organization that this boat really never leaves the port. That's what we have been noticing.
Yeah, I think I'll just close this with two other thoughts just to give you a follow up on what you just said. Is one, definitely in real time as this evolves, there will be we used to have this bank reconciliation statements, right? BRS. I personally believe there'll be CRS also, something called consent reconciliation systems, which maybe DPOs have to submit once in a month to their leadership that, hey, look, these are the number of consents we got, these are the numbers which have been withdrawn, and these have been given, and this is the history. And this reconciliation system is what will become a KPI for any system's performance also, wherein it will be also tagged along with those data systems which are processing personal data. That means reconciliation number 2 will be what system is consuming what personal data and at what level is the consent enabled or not. This is number 1. And number 2, another very interesting discussion I always have with our customers is like, imagine someone taking a photo of the consent what they gave today. They come back to you in 6 years, and they show you after 6 years, this is the consent I have given. Now, prove me that your none of your systems for last 6 years, in case I have revoked for marketing, is not using my information anywhere. What people forget is, if you're not able to prove, because of this is an act, this is not some master direction by anyone, they can literally go to court, give both the documents and say they have violated this. Now, I am going to sue them, right?
Absolutely. And I think that is where the mediation piece also comes into play. I think a lot of litigation individuals are probably also looking forward to it, and naturally they would so, because it's a playground for them, considering how serious people are with implementation today.
Finally, section 8, subsection 1, the most beautiful topic, which is giving nightmares to literally everyone whom I'm speaking to, by the way. And just to give a very big caveat on this is, the nightmare is not limited to small companies. We are talking to global conglomerates, global players. Everyone has this problem. And the problem is like this. In GDPR, the concept of joint controller ownership, all of that existed. Government of India, through GST and income tax, we all know, loves the concept called reverse charge mechanism, wherein they will say, boss, I will not go after the entire ecosystem. If you are the one who is taking the data and deciding on what needs to be done, then you will be held responsible for every individual vendor who is working with you. Now, here's the interesting engineering problem statement. Vendor propagation of deletion and retention, whatever you're doing for internal systems, you can still control, still understand what the heck is going on. Awesome. How do you do this when there are third parties involved, right? Number 1, how do you do with third parties who are global, big players who will not even talk to you? If you ask you a SOC 2 document, one bot from their company will send you a trust center link and say, go and download it from there, right? Number 1. And number 2, how will your APIs work in case integrations fail in the middle of some propagation?
Right. I think smaller companies are in here for a big toss. Either they're existing, for example, if we look at a simple mechanism where a small vendor is using something such as AWS as a CSP, of course, the power dynamics would not help that smaller vendor to negotiate or maybe even talk to a representative from AWS, because of course they are at that scale where they won't get into each of those individual accounts. But of course, putting that aside, where you have a very large vendor or an enterprise vendor, those smaller vendors may also have more vendors which are smaller in scale than them as well. So to cover that piece and to make sure that there is some sort of interoperability between both of them, and to prevent these pieces, because the first thing that you mentioned here is about replacing CSV exports with logged API access. Right now, to enable a smaller vendor to have someone also understand what exactly should be an API based sharing is also something that is very, very difficult, right? Because they are more likely to just say ki no one will come to us, because the data protection board is a 4-member team. They won't have the time to come and probably fine us for a breach that occurs at our end. And that is the common notion in the industry as well, that because the data protection board will comprise of 4 members, how many companies will they identify, and how many companies will they hold accountable? So Fear mongering, of course, helps when it comes to sales in this industry, but fear mongering does not help when you actually want to get something implemented, because engineers do not really care about those fines. What they care about is system performance, system impact, and how the customer would be impacted more around those fines, because they know that these fines exist. They know that there are lawyers who will, fight off and try and make sure that this doesn't come to play. But what matters more to them is, of course, the usability of the product and how the customer interacts with it. Coming back to the original piece about API-based sharing, uh, existing platforms should enable these features as a part of their own transformation journey, as a part of their own feature enhancement, so that smaller vendors, smaller organizations that are not as tech savvy as maybe other companies can also comply with this. And it is more of a responsibility than anything else, Shashank, because if you are a company, if you are a organization and you're catering to small businesses in India and you don't have something like this that protects them and enables them, and if you're charging for something like this, it of course has a lot of ethical discussions around it. But then again, these features are something that you should enable, because in the end, it will also protect you, right? As a processor, it will protect you in the future, because when all of this comes into play and when the data protection board goes actively to chase companies, naturally these processors will also be held accountable, because they are a part of the entire supply chain somewhere. And with all these audit trails coming into play, it will become very evident as to how they are involved and what exactly is their role as well. So that in those senses, I think this really, really helps.
I think exactly. I'll just add to this whole API piece, right? In real time, another problem statement which I see very regularly is uh, either it's engineering or business teams or even finance team. They kind of bring on new vendors on a regular basis. Uh, Incidentally, previously, vendor risk management was only for some entities under RBI, which vendor is working with you. Now the problem is, uh, if you have enabled a vendor and those APIs are interconnected for, say, a consent propagation, the another problem is that if the vendor is removed tomorrow, how fast can you redo those connections with the new vendor? Number one. Number two, another bigger topic, Krishna, is offboarding.
Yeah.
Suppose what people are not understanding. Suppose you're offboarding a vendor, bring another vendor. What happens to data of the personal data what the vendor is currently sitting on, consented data, whose life is still not over, right? You are leaving someone out of the ecosystem which you have beautifully built. And this, by the way, I'm talking about those companies who are very clear on what they want, robust processes and everything. What happens to those companies who don't even understand how complex this will become with third parties?
Absolutely. No, I think another aspect to that, Shashank, is the piece of identifiability, because the law in the DPDP is basically any personal data, right, direct or indirect, which means that how do you exactly even ensure something such as anonymization? And with the data room exercises that happen in India and the data sharing that freely happens, you hash data, you send it to an ad tech vendor, and of course they do targeted advertising and all those pieces. Hash data does not really mean that you're not able to identify an individual again, right? Because if that ad tech vendor gets the same hash value from different players, then naturally, with all the other metadata that they collect about you, it's very, very easy for them to, identify, which is why they are also facing, of course, their fines in certain jurisdictions. But the whole point is, under DPDPA, when companies come to us and say that we are sharing hash data with ad tech vendors, even for that, you need consent. And even for that, you need to make sure that at least, and again, I'm highlighting this piece again about the risk side of it, because DPDPA is not risk-based, it is absolute. Right? You cannot just come and say that the risk is lower, or we did a balancing test, or we did a DPIA to reduce the risk. DPIA, of course, you would do it, but then you also have to solve those risks and make sure that it is done. So nowhere in the Act it talks or specifies risk as much as it does in the GDPR, which is a very key aspect to also understand from a DPDPA perspective.
Great. I think those were the 5 major points which we thought of covering in today's starting session. Well, here's a final deck about what Dutient does, what Redacto does. And before we close, any final 1 minute, Krishna, for you to give your thoughts, then we will jump into if folks have questions.
I just want to probably, part ways with the thought that it's more of, it's not about understanding what is ethical or non-ethical. It is just about being honest about what systems and architectures can do, right? Because you will see a lot of companies claiming a lot of things about, they will do this, or they will change their system in a way that you can navigate this. But to really understand, you really need to focus on a partner that is honest with what your system can do and what their system can do to help you manage this piece. So that clarity and honesty with respect to system architecture is something that really will help you understand as to whether this particular implementation will help you, or is it just a tick box? Because you don't need consulting firms for tick boxes anymore. You have all the LLMs in the world to do that. So use that instead if you're getting a tick box for a compliance assessment, is just my last thought on this.
Great, awesome. Anyone in the audience, you have any questions for us to answer, or we can take notes, we can come back to you guys. Feel free, it's an open mic. Great. I think I want to thank everyone, Krishna, including you. Big thank you for being our debutant webinar expert. Redacto will be doing many more engineering deep dives, and definitely we will have many more sessions with you personally to kind of understand where the trend is going on in terms of engineering capabilities of companies to solve this. I think there are a lot of legal voices, definitely amazing folks out there, but we also want to bring out the real pain points on the ground, whether it's the webhook issue, whether it's the API issue, or whether it's a CSV issue. We'll be covering every data topic which a company needs to solve, not only DPDA, but their aspirations for global privacy regulations.
And I just want to thank the audience as well, because one of the metrics that I used to see whether a webinar was okay or not is the number of attendees at the start versus the end. So that has been fairly consistent. I think probably a couple of people dropped out, and that's about it. So I think we did a fair job as well, Shashank.
So thank you all for being patient, and we will soon come back with much more interesting topic. Thank you, and have
a great week. Bye. Thanks, Shashank. Thanks, team.